Imagine you have to play the world champion on your 17th birthday and you win the game. This is not clickbait, ladies and gentlemen. This happened between Gukesh D, the Indian rock star, and of course, the one and only Magnus Carlsen, the greatest player of all times. Magnus with the white pieces and Gukesh with the black pieces, and we have a Nimzo Larsen attack by Magnus, bishop to b2, attacking the pawn on e5, so Gukesh goes knight to c6, defending the pawn. Pawn to c4 and pawn to d5 is straight up just exploding the center of the board. Pawn takes d5 and queen takes d5. Knight to c3, attacking the queen on d5, which goes back to e6. Knight to f3 and bishop to d7, preparing to long castle. Now pawn to e3 and Gukesh now castles. Bishop to e2 by Magnus, preparing to castle as well. And now Gukesh goes pawn to f5, just launching an attack with all these pawns on the king side. Of course, you castle long, so now your king is safe on the other side of the board, and you can use all these pawns to launch an attack. Short castles by Magnus Carlsen, pawn to e4, attacking the knight on f3. The knight goes to g5, now attacking the queen on e6, which goes back to e8. Now we get pawn to f4, and do you take that en passant? Do you do it? I know it looks very tempting, but that would be actually kind of an inaccuracy. If you take en passant, you would be leaving all this beautiful square you have gained in the middle of the board. So instead, Gukesh goes pawn to h6, attacking the knight on g5, which goes back to h3, and now we get knight to f6, finishing up the development of the pieces you have not moved just yet. Rook to c1, putting the rook on the x-ray with the king on c8, so now Gukesh goes king to b8, just getting the king out of those very annoying tactics in the future. Pawn to a3 by Magnus Carlsen, bishop to e6, doing two things at once, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on b3 and opening up the file for the rook on d8. Now we get pawn to b4 by Magnus, queen to d7, and now attacking this weakness on d2. Attacked by two pieces, of course, and only defended by one. So how do you defend that pawn again? If you push the pawn, of course, that would be just a free pawn. If you defend it with the rook, with rook to c2, congratulations, you just lost your rook. Bishop to b3, pinning the rook. Of course, you can't move anywhere, otherwise you lose your queen. So Magnus finds the best defensive move with knight to b1, defending the pawn yet again. Knight to e7 by Gukesh, bishop to e5, now looking at the pawn on c7 with the bishop and with the rook on c1. Knight to d5, defending the pawn on c7 and bishop to c4, trying to get rid of that defender, but luckily for Gukesh, this knight on d5 is defended by the other knight. So if Magnus ever takes the knight on d5, you can simply take back with the knight to keep the defense on the pawn on c7. Now we get king to a8, getting the king away from this very annoying pin from the bishop, queen to b3, and knight to c6, now attacking the bishop on e5, which goes back all the way to b2. And now we get rook to g8, and now this has two purposes. One is to push the pawn on g5. Of course, you don't want to stay here defending your pieces very passively. You also want to create some threats, some attacks. So rook to g8, supporting the pawn push on g5, also getting the rook away from this pin from the bishop on b2. Knight to c3 by Magnus Carlsen, pawn to g5, and we have a trade of everything on d5. Now, of course, as you can tell, the pawn on d2 is under attack, so Magnus goes rook to c2, defending the pawn. We get pawn to g4 by Gukesh, and now this pawn, this is the hero, this is the MVP, preventing knight to g5, and now the knight has to go back to f2. Now we get pawn to a5 by Gukesh. Usually in these positions, you would love to go pawn to b5, but of course that is defended by the rook, which is on d5, so you pretty much have to take on a5. Rook takes a5, and now the pawn on a3 is attacked by both the bishop and the rook. So Magnus goes rook to a1, defending the pawn again. Bishop to g7, and Gukesh would like to remove this bishop on b2, and Magnus is down. Bishop takes, rook takes g7, and knight to h1. Magnus is trying to maneuver this knight via g3. Rook to d7 by Gukesh, putting the rook on a more active file, and knight to g3, putting pressure on the pawn on f5. Now Gukesh goes king to b8, and careful, don't take the pawn on f5, remember that is defended by the rook on a5. Now both players start maneuvering their pieces a little bit, getting the kings closer to the position. Knight to c5 and rook to b2. Did Magnus Carlsen just fall for a fork? No, he didn't. Just because you see a fork, it doesn't mean it works. If you put a knight on d3 forking the rooks, there will be rook takes b7 check. You have to respond to that, and you just lost a pawn for no reason. The knight is currently defending the b7 square, so now Gukesh, instead of putting the knight on d3 right away, he goes rook to a7, defending the pawn, preparing knight to d3. Of course, Magnus sees all of this, and instead he goes rook to a2. We get knight to d3 anyways, attacking the rook on b4, which goes all the way back to b1, and now we get pawn to b5, and if you take the pawn on b5, the rook on a2 would be completely free, so don't do that. Magnus goes pawn to a5, and now we get pawn to b4 by Gukesh, attacking this pawn with the other rook. Magnus responds by pushing the pawn, and now we get king to b6, adding another attacker to that pawn. Rook to a1, and now look at this. These rooks are extremely passive. Meanwhile, Gukesh is very active, attacking pieces, gaining more space. Now we get rook to b5, followed by pawn to b3, attacking the rook on a2. The rook goes to a3, and now we get pawn to b2, now attacking this rook on a1. And now we successfully removed one of the defenders from this pawn on a6, and we can finally take it. Rook takes a6, rook takes, and king takes a6. Knight to e2 by Magnus, followed by knight to d4, attacking the rook on b5, which goes back to b6, and now Gukesh goes pawn to c5, and this blunders the pawn on f5. Now this position is a draw, but they're very low on time and Gukesh has some winning chances, so he goes rook to b4, threatening to go rook to c4 check, followed by rook to c1. So Magnus goes knight to d6, preventing rook to c4. That is absolutely crazy. Now we get king to b6 and Magnus takes the pawn on e4, sacrificing the knight momentarily, but that is to remove the defender of the knight on d3. But of course, you do not want to move that knight anywhere. This knight on d3 is doing an amazing job. So Gukesh goes pawn to c4, defending the knight yet again. And now all of a sudden, Magnus starts running with the f-pawn, getting the pawn as far as possible. Rook to f1, trying to go pawn to f7. So Gukesh has to go rook to b7, preventing that idea. Knight to e4, and now rook to a7, threatening to go rook to a1. So now Magnus pushes the pawn, and we have a rook trade. Knight to d6, forking the king and the pawn on c4. And now Gukesh goes knight to e1, forking the king and the pawn on g2, and he will put the knight on f3, preparing to take the pawn on h2 in any point. Pawn to d5 check, the king goes to e7, king to d3 by Magnus, and now Gukesh goes pawn to h4, and he wants to create a pass pawn with pawn to g3, and if you take on g3, pawn to h3, and it is impossible to stop the promotion. So Magnus goes king to e3, and now if you push the g pawn, that will be a free knight, and then if you take on h2, king to g2, preventing the promotion, and this would be losing for the black pieces. So instead, Gukesh takes the pawn on h2, then pushes the g pawn, and in this position, Magnus only has one move that doesn't lose the game on the spot. And the move is pawn to d6 check, then king to e6, and knight to d2. You might say, well, isn't this a free pawn? Well, yes it is, but I'm making a queen and you can stop that. So this is losing. But Magnus did not find this move, unfortunately. Instead, he went knight to d2 right away, and this is losing on the spot. There's pawn to h3 by Gukesh, knight to f3, and knight to g4 check, and now it is impossible to stop the h-pawn from becoming a queen. King takes g3, h1 queen, and king takes g4, and now this is a queen versus a knight and two pawns, and I'm telling you, dude, this is hard. You have the knight is always defended by the king. Those two pawns are extremely advanced. It is hard to make progress here. How do you do it? Queen to h4, look at this. This is a double check, attacking the knight, attacking the king at the same time, but you just go king to f5 and now everything is protected. Now even queen to h5, pinning the knight on g5, but you just move the king out of the way and there's simply no danger here. Queen to g6, and they kept shuffling the pieces around for a very long time, and Magnus really wanted to make progress. He kept pushing the pawns. He wanted to create as much trouble as possible for Gukesh. Knight to b5 check, the king goes to d8, and now eventually the queen gets to d6, and Magnus tries a very last trick. He goes pawn to e7, and now if you take that pawn with the king, there's knight to f5, and that is a royal fork, and now this is a draw. If you take the pawn with the queen, now there's knight to c6 with the same royal fork and the same draw. And Magnus forgot for a split second that Gukesh could take the pawn on d7 instead. And in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigned. There is nothing to do. The pawn on e7 is going to fall. The only way to defend it would be to go knight to f5, but there's queen to e6 with a double check. And the knight is falling, the pawn is falling as well, there's nothing to do. Magnus got a good laugh because he forgot that the king could take the pawn on d7. And Gukesh D on his 17th birthday took down the best player in history. What is a better gift than that? You tell me. And of course, if you liked the video, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you tomorrow on the very next game.